Welcome back. We're so glad you're still with us. We are going to now make use of those Q-SYS TV user components that we downloaded. And part of what we want to do is we want to provide both just some simple power control on our UCI, but also we want to start thinking about some really helpful automations. Let's look at the scope of work. What we want to accomplish in this video is we want to add a power button for the displays to the UCI. Here's what we want to do. We want to turn on the televisions when a laptop is connected, and then we also want to turn off the televisions when the TVs go to sleep. All right? And we're going to work through a couple of different communication methods for those things. We are going to provide a button. We are going to turn them on at a convenient time, and we're going to turn them off at an appropriate time as well. And don't worry, we're going to step our way through it. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to come over to schematic elements, and I'm going to type in text because I'm looking for a text controller. You could just run down the list until you found it, but I get lost by shiny objects. So I like to find it by putting in text, and then I pull in a text controller. And I'm going to sort of shove these around a little bit to organize my space a little bit. And one of the first things that I'm going to do is actually tell you, why did I just pull in a text controller? Why didn't I just keep using the UCI script? And the answer is, well, in the same way that every function should have a singular purpose, it's a really good idea for scripts to have singular purposes. So we are going to make a script that has as its single job is to control the television power. So let's name this thing. I really like Nate's trick that he showed earlier.
Of naming everything Nate's?
In the other class. Yeah, no, we're not going to name everything Nate.
Oh, I've named my text controller Nate.
I am sure that you did. No, I really like your trick of taking the space out in between text and controller. Because that's going to make the text controller extra wide so that we can see more of the control pin names as we make control pins. This is going to be display power text controller. And there we go. And when I click on the text controller, it gives me the opportunity here for us to begin a conversation of what kinds of controls do we actually want. We are going to start with the idea of we want power buttons. But there's the idea of, do I want one power button or do I want an on button and an off button? And the answer is it depends on what your client wants. For educational purposes, we are going to choose one big power button that's going to turn both TVs on and both TVs off. That button, as you may expect, is going to be a toggle button, and we're going to name it BTN Power. And it is a toggle button. But I'm also going to add two more controls. I'm going to name them BTN Power On, and I'm going to configure it to be a trigger. And I'm going to configure BTN Power Off, and we're going to configure it to also be a trigger. Now, why did I do that? Also, we're going to give these guys output pins. Now, why did I make these triggers? I made them triggers because if I look in my user component, and I look all the way down into here, it tells me that its power on and power off, which are the flags that I have for getting to it, are also triggers. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to configure ours to be triggers, and then we're going to wire them in. Now, one of the things you may remember that I told you earlier when we were talking about layers is that when Q-SYS presents things to you, like lists of control pins, how do they do it, Nate?
Alphanumerically.
You got it. Off, alphanumerically comes before on. And so as we wire these things in, we need to be careful to wire them in the correct order.
You know, something I'll say while you do that is that Colargic TV component that comes in, it's got the signal tags pre-made called power on and power off. But in the spirit of good naming conventions, that's not a good naming convention because, boy, there's a lot of things in this design that might be powered on or powered off that we might want to use later on. I personally would delete those signal tags and rename them something that is more descriptive so I know it's a signal tag for this particular display rather than just generically power on and power off.
You know what, Nate? I agree with you. We're going to call this KTV on and KTV off. I agree, and I think that actually is a good idea. The clearer we can name things, the better. KTV for Colargic TV. It resolves ambiguities. That's a good call.
Especially when you get to the point where you've got tons of signal tags in your design. Like if you hit spacebar on any control pin right now, especially if it's an input pin, you're going to see we've already got tons of signal tags in this design. When you're scrolling through them, it will make your life better if they are in some way organized, especially with prefixes that group similar controls together.
It's a good idea. So B1 displays, because I did not name mine Nate, is the layer that we want to see. Also remember to make sure that you're on the active layer because I wasn't and that would have been a boo-boo. I'm going to pull my button on and size it the size that I want it to be. I have made it the width of that whole central control region just because, again, that's me. And I'm going to make it be 90 units tall, just like usual. And then I'm going to push it all the way to the top. I'm going to apply some classes. It is button style 1. It's going to have some text on it. Medium. It is a power button, so icon, there it is, icon power. So before we get into doing all the automations, let's just make this bit work first. Let's open our script. Let's begin to think, right? Because remember, our paradigm for how to write code is before we get into syntax, we're going to think our way through it with our little notes. So what we are going to do is we're going to start like this. When the toggle button is pressed, what do I want to do? What do you think, Nate? What should we do?
I would say that when the toggle button is pressed, it should probably order me a pizza.
Of course.
I'm guessing it should also deliver just like pallets of money.
No. Here's what I mean. Let's start thinking about what is the behavior of a toggle button. When I press it, sometimes it becomes true and sometimes it becomes false. And I want to do different things in the different situations. So as I'm thinking through my code before I write syntax, I'm going to think about it this way. When the toggle button is pressed, right? If button became true, right? Then I'm going to want to do certain things, right? Else, if button became false, then I'm going to want to do some other things. What is it that I'm going to want to do if the button became true?
Things.
Well, of course, but like what things, Nate?
Oh, I just typed in things, and I'm assuming that Lou is going to take care of that for me, right?
No. If we think, when I poke the button, there are a number of things that I want it to take place. Namely, I want to turn on the TV. Well, I want to set some button feedback. That would be a good thing to do. Also, and this is a little bit clever, we're going to make use of that idea of the legend again, and we're going to set some feedback on the legend also. So set legend feedback. All right. What about on the false side? Probably the corresponding things, right? We want to turn off the TVs. We want to set the button feedback in the correct ways. And we also want to set legend feedback. There's actually one last idea that you should think about here. One of the great things about being a programmer is this opportunity to think, right? Think. When am I going to want to do all of these things? Obviously, when I press the button, but I might also want to do many of these things when I connect those HDMIs. I might also want to do many of these things when the televisions go to sleep. Nate, what does it mean we're going to do here?
Functions.
We're going to do a function, but this time we're going to do a function with a wrinkle because that function needs an extra piece of information, namely a Boolean state, a true or a false. We're going to write a function and we're going to pass in Booleans. If we pass in true, then we'll do the true stuff. If we pass in false, then we'll do the false stuff. And that's going to work for our buttons, for connecting our HDMIs, for the televisions going to sleep. So we're going to functionize just like you thought we were going to do. We're going to add this one more idea of passing in arguments. And this really shouldn't be a terrible idea because we've already been working with arguments in functions. Remember set UCI layer? That was a function that took arguments. We can write our own functions that also take arguments.
And that little control trick you showed last time, that's an argument too, right? With the event handler?
Yeah, it kind of is.
Same idea, passing in the Boolean state into the activity.
Yeah. We are actually going to call a function that performs according to the Boolean state passed in. So we actually, in lines 3 through 10, we didn't describe the code for the button. We actually defined what we want the function to do. And then the event handler for the button is just going to call the function. In the same way that the event handler for the HDMIs connecting and disconnecting, it's just going to call the function. So let's write the function. Come down here, line 12-ish. That should be okay. We're going to write function func power, and we're going to put in arg boolean. Now, this is just, right, why arg boolean?
Probably because it hurt itself, I'm guessing. The Boolean banged its knee on the table and said, arg!
Arg, right? No,
Yeah.
It's a pirate. It's a pirate.
That's a good point.
It's a pirate
Yeah,
Boolean. Arg is my shorthand for knowing that I'm working with an argument Boolean because that's a Boolean that I'm going to pass in. So what do we want this function to do? We already planned it out. Let's just execute the plan. If arg Boolean, because we're going to pass that in, and sometimes it's true, sometimes it's false. So if arg Boolean, then true stuff, else false stuff, and then we're going to end the if. So what do we want on the inside here? We're going to want stuff like this. We're going to want to turn on the television. Now this actually is a little bit of a trick. How do we turn on the television? We are going to make an observation. One of the things that we did is that we wired these trigger buttons into these trigger buttons. And in fact, if I were to emulate, there are a few things that already work. Namely, if I activate the power on trigger button, they automatically are telling both televisions to turn on. This is simply because we have wired the one button to the two pins. And so these trigger buttons are able to trigger the on and off in those two user components. All we really need to do is, when we run that function, is we need to tell these trigger buttons to trigger. That's it. Let's do that. Here's the syntax for that. What is the name of our trigger button? Controls.btn power on, and then we are going to use the following method. And this is a thing that really only works on trigger buttons. It is the method called :trigger. :trigger on a trigger button causes it to, is like poking it. coming out of its output pin will be that trigger pulse that goes downstream. That's what it means to trigger a trigger button.
Now, when typing that one, the autofill didn't help us out so much, right?
Let's see, controls.btn power off : yeah, it didn't. So sometimes you still got to know a few things.
All right.
And that's why you're here. You're learning a few things. So there it is. We've done turn on and off the televisions. Let's set the feedback. We are going to want to tell controls.btn powers.boolean going to be true. That's good. And down here, controls.btn power.boolean going to be false. That's all right. And then what about that legend feedback? Here's what we're going to do, controls.btn power.legend. And we're just going to put a little string on it. And so this is one of those places where I used to work with a guy, and he always wanted like mute buttons to turn different colors and to say different things. And Ryan, I finally get to give it to you. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make this toggle button say very descriptively, the TVs are on, press to turn off. Or alternatively, TVs are off, press to turn on, in an effort to resolve ambiguity about what does the light mean. Does it mean press it to turn it on or press it to turn it off, right? It was a thing. Anyway, we can resolve that ambiguity with a little bit of work here on the legend. So TVs are on, press to turn off. And alternatively, down in the false business, we are going to say that the TVs are off, press to turn on. And we will hit save, and that's going to be our function. So let's write the event handler for the power button. Where is the power button? It is in the list of controls. Controls.btn power.event handler is a function. We're going to pass in CTL, just like you expected, Nate. And what function are we going to call? Well, the only one we know, func power, and we're going to pass in CTL.boolean. So if you think about it, every time I poke a toggle button, its Boolean state will go from false to true or from true to false. Whatever the state of that button is when we press it is what we are going to send in, right? So when you poke it, it goes from false to true. We are going to send a true in to the func power. If we press the button and it transitions from true to false, we're going to send a false into func power. So hit save, and if you're in emulation, you should be able to turn your televisions on and off and get immediate gratification of your TVs turned on and your TVs turned off, and you got an immediate the lights and the legend. It did all the things. It did all the things, and it was amazing.